What happens when your worst fear becomes your reality? Hi, I'm Brent Cassidy. Welcome to the Nightmare Success In and Out podcast, where we explore how to overcome your fears and nightmares and set yourself free. We're going to be exploring this topic with guys I was in Leavenworth with and others who survived their own nightmare. These stories can be inspiring, sometimes sad. There's some humor, but hopefully you can come away with a nugget of something that'll help you knock down some of the prisons you built up in your own mind. All right. Welcome back, Nightmare Success In and Out listeners. This is where you come for what happens when your worst fear becomes your reality. How do you adapt, survive, overcome, set yourself free? Well, I'm going to switch things up on you a little bit today because I've got somebody on the show. I've been really excited to have this interview. And Brian Koehn comes from us. He's the co-founder and CEO of Social Purpose Corrections. And I was just talking to him about, how this show has evolved is really how you handle situations in your experience and what you do with it. Can you improve on it? Can you make an impact? Can you make things happen from your experiences? And that's really what Brian's his experience is and what he's doing now as the co-founder and CEO of Social Purpose Corrections. But a little bit about his background. Brian's shared passion for corrections reform and social justice prompted him to end his 28-year career in corrections and start SPC, which is Social Purpose Corrections. He was the warden of 5 separate facilities. Brian experienced firsthand the existing gaps and opportunities within the criminal justice system. His personal mission is to reform corrections, which is a heavy lift. We were just talking about that. He had 14 years as a warden, 5 separate facilities, and he comes. The other thing that's really interesting about Brian is he actually was a United States Marine in the United States Marines and the Army National Guard, and we were just talking about he in his moonlighting hours is an Ironman Triathlete, which is that's a whole other thing in itself. So don't mess with Brian on Ironman stuff because I've seen those guys compete. But it's I can't wait to unpack all this because Brian is doing some incredible things. His organization has some incredible people on their board, people both who've been in the criminal justice system, people who've served in this criminal justice system, both as inmates and on the other side. And so it's a innovative group of people that are looking to make a difference. Before we get into all that, I want to recognize our show sponsor, Auto Plaza Direct. Who likes spending a couple of weekends walking car lots looking for a car? Then you spend 4 or 5 hours in the dealership to buy a car. It's kind of like a trip to the dentist. And I say that, and I just had lunch with a really good friend of mine that is a dentist. So Eddie, Logan, it's no knock on you, just people are just afraid to go to the dentist. Well, there's a better way to take away all that pain and hassle of getting a car. Auto Plaza Direct, they are your personal car concierge. Just tell them the car you want, what you can pay, and they'll go find that car for you. They'll negotiate your best price. They also offer you warranties and financing. It's all full service. Go to autoplazadirect.com to get started with your personal car concierge. The new hassle-free way, the car buying experience you deserve. Auto Plaza Direct. Tell them Brent from Nightmare Success sent you. Brian Koehn, welcome in. How are you?
Brent, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And I think you just wrapped up, went to a women's prison there in Arizona, and you said you had quite an interesting experience with that. What was your takeaway there?
Yeah, this morning, I'm friends with the CEO of Televerde Foundation, Michelle, and she invited me out to take a look at their programs, and they do job readiness exclusively for women, job readiness in Arizona, Indiana, and Florida. And we're talking about culture, which is root cause to our challenges in the United States. And she's like, "Come see what we're doing." So headed out there, spent the morning with them, sat down. They showed me what they're doing. They have quasi access to the internet, which I thought was really innovative because people just don't do that in corrections. And 0% recidivism rate. I mean, it's just and they actually give people hope. I mean, what a concept.
Well, I mean, and hope is such a, I think the second guy that I interviewed on this show Romo, one of his things he said is his takeaway is, don't ever take away hope from someone because that might be all they have. And I think one of the things that you're doing with your overall passion program is to restore hope within the walls of a community that it can be a hopeless environment for a lot of people. And if there's a way to open up that world, that it's not hopeless, that there is hope for you, then there's a lot of other things that can happen with changing the culture. I'm curious though, Brian, in sixth grade or seventh grade or high school, you don't usually say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get into the prison world and I'm going to become a warden. Now, I'm saying that because I think some people might. I mean, I was in the Leavenworth, Kansas world, and there was like 5 prisons around there, and I think there probably were generations of people that worked in the prison world. But Brian, how did it happen for you? Like, what was going on in your life as a kid that just led you to where you are?
Well, I would argue that nobody ever said, when I grow up, I want to work in a prison. I mean, it's just not the list. Now, obviously exaggerating, I'm sure there are generational families that work in corrections, but not on purpose. I joined the Marines, was discharged after 4 years, got my criminal justice degree, and I was thinking about going in the FBI, but I had to get a master's, and so I was like, well, what do I do? Well, this independent private prison from Minnesota was opening up in Appleton, Minnesota, middle of nowhere. I was like, I had a corrections class in criminal justice.
Yeah.
I was like, fun class. I said, well, I'll take a summer job, just to see what it's like, until I, figure out what I want to do for a master's.
How old would you have been then?
25.
Okay. 25. Yeah. So you were a young guy.
So I took a job in middle of nowhere, Appleton, Minnesota. They hired me as a supervisor because of my Marine Corps experience. Startup facility. It was an independent private prison. So what that means, it was owned by the city, not by a corporation. It was owned by the city as an economic development project to bring in jobs because it was a dying farm community. So I took the job out there without really understanding what I was getting myself into. And corrections is a people business. I mean, it is the people business.
Yeah.
Really, to think about it. It got in my blood, and it was rewarding. And, it was career-wise, it was, government that's hard to promote. We all know that.
Yeah.
But in private business, if you perform, there's more opportunity for you. So yeah, I was like, well, this is such a bad thing. I never did go back and get my master's, by the way. But,
So you get into that world, and like you said, it was rewarding. What was it that when you first entered that world as a 25-year-old, what were you getting out of it?
Well, I have to admit that back then my motivations probably weren't as pure as they should have been. I was a Marine, and corrections is very structured and very military. Mm-hmm. How it's designed and operated, which I just automatically tracked to. It was just something I was comfortable with, something I was used to, and something, that was intriguing and appealing to me at the time. Now, I'd love to say it's because I wanted to help residents reform, but I can tell you back then that probably wasn't my motivation. But the reality is that, I was passionate about the staff, and I was passionate about helping the staff. But one of the problems is in U.S. corrections, you're trained a certain way to do corrections. You're programmed right off the beginning. It's a pure punishment model. I will say there are some systems better than others, but in general, system-wide, corrections isn't about correcting. Corrections is about warehousing and punishment.
Right.
And over time, I was good at doing what I was taught to do, and that's the traditional way of doing corrections until I could start thinking for myself and asking questions like, this doesn't make any sense. Why are we doing this? Our outcomes in corrections are, of course, atrocious, which I'm sure you talk about often. But so I was drawn to it because of the military, but I was smart enough to look, listen, and learn, and really understand that most people incarcerated are good people that made bad choices and really grew up with crummy circumstances. There are a few that are just, they're hard to deal with. I've looked into the eyes of evil before, but it's by far the minority. Most people in corrections are good people, and I'm talking about the staff, I'm talking about the residents, and they want to make a good purpose for themselves in their lives, and it just takes time and independent thinking to think beyond what you're taught to do. And that's the culture that we have in our country.
So when you began to see this as a career for yourself, how long did it take you to move through the ranks to get to the warden position? Because I've always wondered, I've never had a chance to talk really to a warden except for my warden, Warden May, that was there. But actually was, I think for where we were at Leavenworth, was a fairly respected guy. He was all about cleanliness, so he did his walkthrough on Fridays. But for the most part, the odd thing is the inmates appreciated that, because we didn't want to live in a bad, dirty place. And so his walkthrough kind of pushed other people that weren't doing what they should do to fall in line. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you're all living where a place you can't get out of. And those people who weren't living in their little area as they should had to make sure that they were, and that's not so bad. But how long did that process take for you, Brian? How does somebody get through that process? Like, how does somebody become a warden of a prison? Is there a stepping stone of how that happens?
Yeah, again, back to the military analogy, it's in the military you have private and corporal or lance corporal, sergeant, staff. You have a structure that you go through in order to get promoted. Well, corrections is very similar.
Mm-hmm. It is, and actually, they use somewhat of the same names. Of captains
they vary, but it's officer, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, major, and then typically it goes to like assistant warden and warden.
Right.
So there's a structure, and you have to hit the tiers on the way through. I should say in general, you can skip some of them depending on, an educator can be a warden. So you don't have to come through the security ranks. But the reality is you move up through that regimented chain of command. That's how you get there. You just do well at what you do, and you're recognized for it, and you get promoted.
How long did it take you to get to that point in your life to be a warden?
I was pretty young. Before I was warden, I was head of security of 65 prisons. So, which is pretty difficult job.
Yeah.
Number one priority of any correctional facility is security. So, I was the tactical guy. So I was we called it SORT. In law enforcement, they call it SWAT, but it's the response team when things go bad. I was good at those things. So, and that's partly what got me recognized, moving up through the ranks, because I was a problem solver. Now, unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of tools in our toolbox back then. And it was, again, back to the traditional way of doing corrections. But if there was a hostage or a riot, they called me, and I showed up with a whole bunch of folks, and we fixed things.
Mm-hmm.
Which obviously got recognition. And I got my first warden job when I was 42 in Tennessee. Yeah.
So, Brian, because it's always interesting to me, because I was living as an inmate in that environment. When a warden goes into a prison, like when you think, okay, because everybody shows up at the same place, so we're all living basically together for so many hours. What did you have, like a checklist of things that as you entered the day that you focused on, or was it as things happened in the prison?
Well, I think it's a little both. And I think it might be helpful for your audience to understand what is a prison.
Yeah.
It's in reality, although the title I held was warden, I was really city manager. That's what I was. I was responsible for managing a city that the whole population didn't want to be there. And so it was a little different than a city like our hospital. So in a prison, you have a hospital, you have a high school, you have a major restaurant, you got your own public works, you got your own police department. It's all within the fence of prison. So you're running a city.
Mm-hmm.
the difference is you have intimate knowledge of everything going on in your city versus, a free world city. I mean, I know how many HIV cases we had. I know how many, how many that we had that were in the population that were maximum custody versus minimum custody. I knew who had an education, who didn't. I had access to all that information as a quote unquote city manager, as a warden. And so the reality is in many ways, it depends on how well your facility is running. If you're under crisis mode, all you do is you fight fires all day. I mean, your whole life is a firefighter. I was a prison fixer. I mean, that was what I was known for, and they transferred me from place to place to fix them. So, the reality is there's typically a routine to it. It's, again, going back to the city manager analogy. You have your meetings on Mondays. You're meeting with your team. What is the current situation? What's your staffing looking like? How many do we have in training? Do we have enough to fill all the positions for the officers? Do we have enough nurses? Which is always the point of the conversation because nobody has enough nurses. Do we have enough mental health staff, which are hard to find? Okay, if we don't have them, how are we going to get them? So you have those kinds of bigger picture conversations. But it's in the prisons, with maybe two exceptions, I spent a good amount of the day walking the back.
That's what I was curious about, how you interacted with the population, because I don't know what level you were at, but I'm assuming within any, from a low to a max, you're dealing somewhat with the scheduled moves and everything else that happens with that's somewhat similar. You're just having a different type of population that has different custody levels, but how did you move around in that population?
And I ran. I mean, as a warden, we had max custody, we had minimum custody. I'd be honest with you, the higher custody, I preferred the higher custody versus the lower custody. But I walked the units by myself all the time. Every day, I'd sit down on spider tables and talk to always walking up a pod or unit, you talk to the staff first. Make sure they're okay. They have the resources they need to do their job. Help and answer any questions. And then once that's done, then I go and you talk to the residents. Walk through the unit. Kind of go door to door, looking at all the cells, and you make sure that you talk to all the races. Never single out one race. That would be a really bad idea.
Well, you might explain that, because I think for a lot of people who don't know much about the prison population, it's primitive to the point where it's almost in a protective environment that the Hispanics hang out with the Hispanics, the blacks hang out with the blacks, and the whites hang out. And that there, I think as you lower the custody level, once you get down to the camp level, you see less and less of that. But there are people that work their way down to the custody level that kind of still think in that world.
Well, the reality is it's about two things. Number one, it's about protection. Prison is a scary place, especially for the first timers, and only 13% of people who go in prison are in there for the first time. But for the first timers, it's scary. I mean, what do you know about prison besides Shawshank Redemption and the Orange is Black or the Green Mile? So it's protection, but it's also in many ways control. When I talked earlier about root cause, the races control the races. So each race has their own leaders, and those leaders have their own agendas. And their own agendas, might be to, one group might want to, bring in the drugs into the facility. One group might be responsible for bringing in tobacco facility. One might be responsible for making alcohol in the facility, and they kind of work with each other in trade. I'm being very general.
Yeah.
By the way, it's way more complicated than that. But the point being is there's security in grouping with races, but it's also root cause to our problem in our country. You shouldn't have to go to prison and be protected.
Right.
You should go to prison because you want to better yourself, and that's not about hanging in the day room and playing cards or dominoes, with your friends, which are exclusively the same race. I mean, you can't eat chips out of another race's chip bag, or you can get yourself in a lot of trouble. I mean, it's that thick political wise inside.
When did, Brian, your thoughts evolve? And how long a process was that as you were walking through? I mean, 5 different facilities as a warden, you saw a lot of different things, and obviously saw a lot of things before you were warden. What was it, just a general slow evolution, or did you just, as you got into understanding where you were, how it rolled, what happened day to day, you started thinking, wait, this could be done differently.
What, this is insane? Yeah,
Insane is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
well, my background's a little different. I work for private corrections, so I didn't work government corrections, and private corrections is different. Clearly there's a profit motive, but there's also an efficiency motive, which is connected to the profit. So you really have to understand the root cause of the problem if you're going to fix. And corrections is famous for putting Band-Aids on a gunshot wound. It might look pretty on the skin, but it really does no good underneath.
Right.
And in private corrections, again, it's about root cause. And as a warden in private corrections, you're traditional corrections person, like a government warden would be, but you're also a CEO because you're responsible for millions
budget.
Of dollars.
Yeah.
And so you got to have to balance that. And so my experience on the private side is really understanding root cause. I mean, there's numbers out there. For example, there's a study that says each violent incident costs $17,000. Well, violence is expensive, not only in lives but in cost. So what do you do to reduce the violence? Or, recidivism. We all know. Well, I think most of your listeners know it's a 2/3 fail rate.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how do you fail 2/3 of the time and still exist? And you start really as a leader. As an administrator, I started asking these questions like, this is just crazy. And then the lifespan of a correctional officer is 59 years old. I mean, how toxic does a culture have to be to take 19 years of your life for a male? Female is even longer. Was it 76 for average lifespan for a male right now, and 80 for 81, I think.
Yeah.
Well, corrections at 59. And so, at what point do you say, especially understanding root cause, because again, I was responsible for making money while running prisons, understanding the cause of the problems in the prisons. And, after a while, I just shake my head and go, we can't keep doing this. I mean, this is insane. People are dying. Corrections is, if we had to give a word for corrections in this day and age, it should be punishment. Mm-hmm. There's no correcting about it.
Right.
It's very few resources. Populations are locked down all the time. They're sitting around day rooms with nothing to do and no education. And then we wonder why we have problems. What do you think's going to happen? Mm-hmm. It's having that understanding is part of the awakening I think I had. To start this whole nonprofit model. How do we take the efficiencies that, private corrections, and I know privates is a lightning rod, and I get it, but you take the efficiencies, and apply them into a nonprofit model, take the, net revenue, the benefit of what's gained and put it back into people. Don't give it to Wall Street and don't give it to a CEO. Give it back to the people, and so, because what's missing in many cases to change the corrections cultures is resources. It's money.
Yeah.
There's no money to hire more nurses. There's no money to pay a psychologist more than the local hospital to pull them away to actually help the residents, because the hospital pays way more than you do and you're restricted by how much you can give them. Well, then you have nothing, or you have ones that may not be engaged with what you're trying to do. So. You bring all these solutions to the table, and when I was at a conference, I was like, what if somebody took the goods of efficiencies, that private corrections uses, applied to a nonprofit model, and then take any revenue that's generated and put it right back into people?
Well, I like you have a quote that's on your website that says, what if 100% of prison net revenues were reinvested into drug, alcohol rehabilitation, on-site job training, and education programs, accessible mental health and self-care treatment, mentorships, employee training, medical care, real-world reentry assistance, with the single goal of creating a sustainable correctional model that truly reduces the rates of incarceration and recidivism. That's a big statement. And that's, think about what that could be. Think about what that could be. Because, one of the things I think that you find in the prison is you have a situation where it's an us versus them mentality, and it's built that way. I've seen and heard, different people talk. The one thing I mistakenly did is I went to shake the guy's hand when I got my first job up at the food warehouse. And my CO was a great guy. He was one of the good guys when I worked at the food warehouse, and he was a family guy and 3 kids, and he liked the Royals and I liked the Cardinals, and we just really clicked. But and then one of the inmates said, "They don't shake your hand, Brent. That's not what you do." But what it feels like though is that you're being cowered into an animal corner, that you're less than a human because that's not something that you're supposed to do. But I also understand that the way that they're trained, the CO's trained, is not to create personal relationships or get too close, because you can be manipulated. And once that manipulation happens, and there's a lot of good manipulators that are there, that can turn into certain things like bringing stuff in or having relationships or all those different things. So how do you close that gap? Because one of the things that I read, Brian, that it's actually on your LinkedIn page, which I think everybody ought to check out. It's a great blog. It was Susan Morris, who's now, her name is Folk, and Adam Clausen, who was serving 213 years without the possibility of parole, and how she changed and got these guys, these leaders in that community, to come to her way of life coaching, basically, and it changed the culture of the prison. It fascinated me because the effect of that in a world like that, it almost seems like an impossibility, but it happened there, and it happened, in a few other places. But when you were a warden and experiencing that us versus them mentality, I'm sure you felt it from your end.
Well, that's part of the lifespan problem is, that in corrections, because of the fear of staff being compromised, they've completely separated the staff from the population. I mean, the culture today, and I make this as a general statement, but I think it applies for most of U.S. corrections, is an officer can't engage any relationship. If they even have a conversation with more than 5 minutes with a resident, they can be put under investigation for being compromised. They move them from post to post to post constantly, because they don't want them to get over familiar with the people inside of that unit.
Well, and the other flip side of that, on the us versus them, if I'm spending 5 to 10 minutes talking to a correctional officer, I can be seen as a snitch. So
witness.
Yeah. So there's that mentality too. So those are the things we're talking about, Brian, that are hard to overcome because it's a built-in foundation to the institution.
Well, Brent, you're right. But that's what we bring to the table with our nonprofit solution is, if you look at other examples in the world that have been successful, and Norway's been one of them. Now, I hesitate there because Norway is a way different country than the United States, but they took recidivism from 91% to 21%. I mean, ours right now is at 89% after 9 years of being released.
Right.
2/3 after 5 years or 3 years.
Yeah,
So what did they do to change their culture? Now, the 3 main things: dynamic security, which I'll get back to, normalcy, and the import model. That's what they credit their culture change. Now, dynamic security, there's 2 types of security. You have static security, which we use in the U.S. almost exclusively. In static security, it's razor wire, doors, guns, and tighten security when something goes bad. Where dynamic security is you allow the staff to have a professional, not personal, professional relationship with the residents. Okay. The other thing they do different is normalcy. They operate the inside of the facility as normal as possible as the free world. So it's not as such of a big shock when you go from a completely controlled institutional world and you can't even walk in Walmart because you're afraid when you get out.
Right.
Which I hear that's
there's a number of people that I've interviewed on this show that had panic attacks from entering a Walmart or a Costco or a grocery store. There was too much sensory overload.
And then the third thing is the import model. You bring the community into the prison because it's corrections is a community problem. I don't know if problem's the right word, but community challenge. In the U.S., you take corrections, you take the residents, and you put them in a prison way far away from society, and you forget about them. That's where bad people go. And you don't even want to think about them. That's how we treat it in the U.S. And so when you look at the Norway way they do things, some of those principles can apply to us, but we have to modify them to work in mass incarceration. If you look at the Maine State Prison, like when I toured them, it's a max custody prison that has almost no violence, almost nobody in restrictive housing.
Mm-hmm.
The sex offenders live with general population. If that isn't a sign of a healthy culture, I don't know what is. By the way, for your listeners, that almost never happens.
No.
Sex offenders usually go in protective custody or they go into their own living unit. So, but in Maine, they live in general population because people do their time. And how that happens is when you look at these principles of Scandinavia or Norway, and you apply them, of course, again, modify them to work for us, they are effective. They're effective strategies. Now, we can't do it like Norway. They have a 2-year officer academy. Not going to happen here. You're lucky if you get 4 or 5 weeks. They have a 1 to 6 staff to resident ratio. We're lucky we have 1 to 120. And so there's differences between, but the core to culture change, in my opinion, is built into our model. And Susan and Adam and others modeled that at FCI McKean, but it's to bring a coaching model in. And it's really our version of dynamic security, where we allow the officers to have a professional relationship with residents. I mean, shake hands, use first names. Now, the officer can't talk about their kids,
right?
But they can say parent. But they can talk with the resident, as encouragers. So they're not social workers, they're not mentors, they're encouragers. Kind of the analogy I like to use, is more of a football analogy.
Mm-hmm.
In today's corrections, the residents are on a team, on the offense, trying to move their ball down to the end zone, which is release and success in society. But who's the defense? Well, in today's corrections, the defense is housing, it's jobs, it's the felon tag, which really you have a life sentence once you're a felon. Your life's going to be difficult no matter what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And then the correctional officers are also on the field, preventing the residents from moving forward because of how our culture exists in our country for the static security aspect of it. And so what we do is we pull the officers off the field and we put them on the sideline as coaches, encouragers. Now, you're still going to have the housing stuff that residents are going to have to fight against. You're still going to have the fact you're a felon, which is going to be a challenge. You still have, the jobs thing and transportation thing. But the officer should be on the sideline encouraging the residents to move through those challenges to their end zone,
mm-hmm.
not be on the field stopping them from moving to their end zone. And so we're pulling the officers off the field. We're putting them on the sign. Now, if somebody causes a foul, you're going to throw a flag and you're going to hold you accountable. Accountability is very important to reform. But you don't do it on the field, stopping them from moving forward. You do it on the sideline as an encourager, as a coach, so that they learn from it, because society's full of rules, and those who don't follow the rules end up obviously incarcerated.
I like the analogy. How difficult is it in the world you're in, Brian, to have these innovative thoughts for the other people that are in this world?
It's difficult. When you think about it, I mean, if you look at corrections and you look at our society, what is one of our biggest challenges? It's corrections.
Mm-hmm.
And no one's really been totally successful. Obviously, there are some places that are better and some are worse. And I would argue, good leaders, but when they leave, sometimes the next person just erases all the good they did. But the reality, is, there's roadblocks everywhere we turn around.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're suggesting a whole different way of doing corrections, and so people are intrigued by the idea of a nonprofit running prisons and jails
mm-hmm.
and medical departments, by the way. But we bring innovation to the table. And the advantage that we have, and I quite frankly don't like to talk about myself, but I guess in this situation, I kind of have to.
I'm interviewing you, Brian. You got to brag on yourself a little bit.
Well, I'm one of the most diverse corrections leaders in the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, coming from private corrections, I managed BOP, U.S. Marshal detention, immigration prisons, 6 states, 2 jails, men, women, max, minimum. I started a nationwide transgender unit. I mean, who has that kind of background, in U.S. corrections? Not many.
No, and I think that's what interested me to be, and I feel honored to be able to talk to you, because I think that your background is one that you hope that someone like you gets in and says, wait a minute, guys, I've done all this. There's other ways to do this, and we can get an outcome that is much better than what we're getting right now. The problem in a lot of situations is you've got this cycle that runs on both sides. You've got the cycle of the recidivism and a lot of reasons and a lot of things that go on with that is somebody's environment and their family and their neighborhood and everything else that goes around that, and they've got to break out of that. The other part is that you've got people that are actually, that's their job, and you want full beds. You want the place to be full, because if it gets, first step happens and everybody starts exiting the prisons, what does that mean for me as a job? What you're talking about is taking the people that are in the system and tweaking it to creating a better outcome. And I think it's not people losing jobs. It's re-educating, retooling from punishment to rehabilitation to reentry. And that's the thing that, you and I were talking before we got on. There are people who have money that will give money to nonprofits. What worries me about that is that I see dollars going to nonprofits and they don't have the right people around the table. It's a bunch of wealthy people who want to do good, but they don't have people who've experienced it either from your side, Brian, or from my side, that really know the grit and the guts of the problem. And if they could include those people, they could take those dollars that they're creating and really create real change. And I think that with what you're doing with the nonprofit piece gives you the opportunity to go out and talk to these people who really do want to use their dollars to make real change happen. They just got to get with the right people to make that work.
Yeah. And and we've been fortunate. We're still a young organization, but he probably doesn't, I don't know if he wants me to use his name or not, but I'll do it anyway. But our original funder is Gideon Powell. Gideon is a CEO of Troy Petroleum, Texas' largest private oil company, but he's fed up with the outcomes.
Yeah.
And he heard about us through a mutual friend. He's like, Brian, what are you doing? And so I explained to him, he goes, that's the craziest thing I ever heard. He goes, I love it. How do I help? And he's given us a significant amount of money. Arnold Ventures, and you may know who Arnold Ventures is. They're, they just recently gave us $1 million seed money. There's people who see our vision and see us as a solution. But we have to prove it to people. It's all concept as concept, proof is proof. In our model, we're outcomes based. And so when we run our facilities, we come with agreed upon outcomes. If we don't meet the outcomes, don't use us. Why would you want to?
Yeah.
If we can reduce recidivism significantly, which we can, I would say that's arrogant, but it's not. We can. The system's so broken. What we do is going to have major impact. Can we reduce violence? Yes. Can we increase GED? Yes. Can we, and this is not done in prisons in the U.S., can we have people leave our facilities with a job in housing versus just sending them off with $50 in a bus ticket to community corrections and hope that it works?
Yeah.
And it doesn't in most cases. We want them to leave our facilities with a job in housing. If you don't have money and you have $50 a bus ticket, maybe you get a hotel room for one night, then what?
Yeah.
Then maybe you go to social services or the food bank or the shelter, then what?
Then what?
You start making desperate choices.
Right.
Those desperate choices put you back in prison.
Yeah.
And so, for us, it's critical that people leave prepared. And not just the minimum custody guys, which a lot of the DOCs do. We have the reentry program, and that's for the minimum custody, but the max custody and the medium are getting out too.
Yeah, like you said, 95% of the people that are in custody get out. What do you think, Brian, looking at everything that happens within the prison, what do you think is what's most needed? What are, like, within the ingredients of what you put into the pot, what is that?
Well, we're disruptors. I'll just be straight up. And our model is based off 3 pillars. And we have to talk about how do we change culture. And again, I think we talked earlier before we formally got onto the podcast, but we talked about how difficult it is for government to change cultures. And many times I do talks, I'll ask people, give me an example of where the government changed culture. and all of a sudden you hear the crickets in the background, and everyone's like, and they have a hard time. Now they do exist, but they have a hard time finding them. And that's my point. I said, you can't band-aid change a culture, especially within corrections, because the folks that have been there, the correctional officers that have been there 10, 15, 20 years, roll their eyes when they see the new person come in with all these great ideas.
Yep.
Knowing that it's not going to work, and knowing in 2.5 years they're going to be gone anyway. And that core group it replicates the way it's always been done. And you have to reach them if you're going to change the culture. They have to believe that there's a better way. They have to actually believe that they're there to help and not to punish or to warehouse. And so we have 3 pillars. Number 1, you have to change the environment. Everything from correctional officer uniforms so they don't look like cops, to the resident uniforms so they don't look like orange striped, and the words coming to my mind I can't say in a podcast, but they look like an inmate.
Mm-hmm.
The environment that they live in, it's very sterile, it's concrete, it's slamming gates, but you got to change the environment. It's a place of opportunity. It's a place of hope. It's supposed to be. It's a place of reform is what it has to be, but the environment needs to be supportive of that. And it's way deeper than that, but that's
no, I like it. And I'm curious with the blog that's on your page on LinkedIn. How did that happen? How did that with Susan and Adam and that group, how was it able to penetrate into that prison and actually make that happen? How did that happen?
Well, I'll tell the story Susan told me. I probably won't do it as well as she does it, but Susan's an HR person. She's not a traditional security to the system kind of. Her last job, she was head of staff development and training for the Bureau of Prisons. That's a pretty significant responsibility. But so she came in. She's a life coach, and she came in with this idea about how do we empower the residents. Changing the staff mentality is difficult, but what if we change the residents? There's nobody more passionate about hope and reform than the residents. Mm-hmm. I found it this morning when I was at the Tel Verde. And so she said, in the BOP, all the executives go to lunch, to dining, and they sit there and they line up. Everybody walks by them. They have time to ask questions. And so what she did is she spent, I think it was a month, maybe a little bit longer, just watching the population. Who are the influencers? And I'm not talking about staff. I'm talking about residents. Who are the influencers? And after a while, she could see who was the strongest in the whites, who was the strongest in the blacks, who was the strongest in Hispanics, who they all listened to, who sat next to them at the tables. The dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
How all that works in a dining hall. And so she started, once she identified who they were, she started to recruit them to this crazy idea of a peer coaching model, where the residents are trained as life coaches. And then allow them to have influence. Now, luckily, she had a warden that was supportive of what she was doing, mm-hmm. because we all know if a warden is supportive, it's done.
Right.
And so she handpicked them, asked them to come to her office one night to talk about it, and they're like, "Nah, I don't think so. I'm happy where I'm at. Everything's good." And she encouraged them to show up. Well, they drank the Kool-Aid. As soon as she started to explain what she wanted to do, how they were going to be impactful on actually helping the residents. Change the way they think, change the way they act, break the races, where a white guy can sit at a table with African Americans, where an African American sit at a table with Hispanics. It was a way that they could, as coaches, help the residents. And they put together this curriculum, and it was really hard to get selected and really difficult to get certified. And she's gonna be mad at me because I can't state the certification right now, but there's an agency that certifies as life coaches. And they went through the program and they got certified, which is really difficult to do. And they started growing from there, impacting, both wellness really is the end goal. So physical wellness, mental wellness, spiritual wellness, which are all 3 are important. And so they started to change the culture from the resident side. They got permission for these coaches to go into other units besides their own, which some systems won't allow you to do.
Right.
So, good for them. And through that process, they started to change the culture, the officers' culture too, because the officers saw what they were doing.
Started to see the change.
It was making life better for them too.
Yeah.
Less problem. Officers in many cases come to work hoping that they go home alive at the end of the day, or at mm-hmm. least no urine thrown on them. It's a hard job. Mm-hmm. When they saw the tension go down in the population, naturally their attention goes down. And so they made some significant strides and success. When I met Susan, she retired. When I met her and explained what we're doing in a nonprofit, she immediately tracked. She's been volunteering ever since, writing curriculum. We don't have time on your podcast to go through everything we're doing, but God, we got some incredible initiatives that are just going to change the culture and the way we do corrections in our country.
And what you just said too, you had a warden that was open to that idea. And I think the other thing that was interesting about that story is that Adam was a person who really should have been hopeless. He was serving a 213-year sentence without parole. He's out now, by the way. He's going to be on the podcast here. I'm going to interview him next week. But and he's doing incredible work and has only been out for 3 years. But going back into, I've talked to a few people that were in prison when COVID happened, and I can't imagine being an inmate during COVID, because there's certain things that you have that aren't really freedoms, but they're part of your routine. And when they get taken away, for me, I had visits from my wife, Julie, every weekend. And so she drove 4.5 hours there and 4.5 hours back. And that's what kept us plugged in as a family. And I would see my daughters as she would pick them up on the way from where they were in college. But taking that all away, and that was kind of how we did our time. I would work, and I had a prison job. And then I'd work out, and then I would read and do all that. But my big, the reward was seeing and plugging in to family. And, you've got phone calls, you've got email, you've got visits. And I think a lot of those things were taken away during COVID, where the guys were just truly, a lot of people got a little bit of taste of what prison could be like because they lost a little bit of their freedoms and had to stay at their homes and couldn't go to their restaurants or whatever. But in prison, I can't imagine.
It was. I ran 2 prisons during COVID. One was a 1,100 bed federal detention. The other one was a 5,000 bed multi custody, federal and state facility, and it was hard. It's when people come in, you got to quarantine. The CDC required certain things to stop the spread. So you come into prison, you're stuck in a cell by yourself for 2 weeks, or with a cellmate for 2 weeks to make sure you're not contagious. Then we put you in population. If one person is positive, and then the whole unit is affected, then what do you do? You can't let them move anywhere. The staff can't go in the pod without being full PPE. You look like you're walking into a radiation zone half the time. Mm-hmm. In a COVID in a secure environment it was difficult for everybody.
Can't imagine.
Staff are going home with COVID positive and give it to their family because they got it because the resident came in from another facility.
Yeah.
And people, staff died, residents died. It was hard.
I can't imagine. And it's, and to be responsible in that environment, I can't imagine from your job how that would have been, because that would have just ramped everything up that much more. You talk about tension, you talk about staff. One of the things I remember you talking about too was how hard it is to staff, and telling somebody, hey, so and so can't come in, or I don't have this, and you're not going to be able to go home tonight. It's something I didn't even contemplate or think about from my side, thinking of that when you were talking about that on another interview, that staffing and trying to fill those gaps with people is a daily hurdle.
Yeah, if we have recidivism is a crisis, but let me put that aside for a second. The crisis we have in our country right now is security, staffing. Mm-hmm. There are systems with 40, some cases 50% officer vacancies. Well, if you don't have security, programs doesn't happen. If you don't have security, visitation doesn't happen. If you don't have security, rec yard doesn't happen. Security trumps everything,
Yeah.
And so, and the crisis is the younger generation doesn't want to work in prisons. In many ways, I don't blame them. Unless we bring purpose to the job, why would you want to be there?
Yeah.
And that's partly why we have to change the culture. That's partly why we exist,
mm-hmm.
is to show that there's a humane way to run prisons and jails where the staff have purpose. Remember our 3 pillars. We create environment, create community, you create purpose, which is our solution to corrections. I don't think I did get to all 3 of them, but if we don't bring purpose to the job, the younger generation is not going to work there. Standing at a door and being told, don't let anybody walk through this door, the younger generation will say, why? That's silly. Why would I want to do that? The older generation is like, oh, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. I mean, it's just a completely different generation. And we have to bring purpose. And again, if we can't staff security, all the education in the world isn't going to do any good, because education is not going to happen if we don't have enough officers to make sure it's safe and secure. And so that's the crisis in front of us right now. Our nonprofit's end goal is significantly reduce recidivism and reincarceration. That's our end goal. But to get there, we have to find a way to bring purpose to the job and trust our staff and trust our officers, or we will never impact recidivism.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, the two sides have to work together on being the guys that are in and the women that are in have to be accepting to changing the culture, and the reentry part of things, getting out, the more they prepare and not waste time in to prepare themselves for getting out, the more reentry will work, as long as you said, there's not roadblocks, getting blocked down the field to try to get over the goal line. Because it feels like that when you get out. It feels like, damn it, I did my time. I'm trying to get back. And it's hard to get back into this. And then I'm getting hit from this level and that level. And, I've got to call this person. I've got to be at this meeting. The halfway house won't give me a pass. All these different things that happen. And I think, if we can plug those two together with people being accepting of the change in culture, both on the staff side and the inmate side, and then continue to roll that out into purposeful reentry programs that really give people not a handout, but a helping hand to get to the next opportunity. Because there's so many people that are on this show. And one of the things I love about interviewing people on this show is that the narrative is that nobody makes anything of their second chance. And it's hard to make your second chance work, but there are guys and women out there that really are doing the second effort. The interviewing a guy the other day, John Pettigron, he was driving a truck all day and all night, and then he would go to school. He'd get 2 hours sleep, but it was all about that he wasn't going to let this get him back to where he was before. And there's so many stories like that of breaking the narrative, but it's so hard to break the narrative that if we could just make it a little smoother, both on the inside and outside, so that it's not so difficult to get over that hurdle. It's like you're pushing that rock up the hill, and any wrong move, that rock comes back on you. And that's the challenge.
Well, part of the challenge, and I agree 100%. I mean, I just talked to a friend who's justice impact. She can't buy a house in a subdivision because they do a background check on her and she's a felon. She can't take the bar. She finished law school but can't take the bar because they flagged her because she's a felon. Yeah. It's a life sentence. That's one of the challenges you got to get past. But it to the point of the benefit, I think, of your podcast and many others is how do we educate general society that what we're doing, it's not about locking up bad people. I mean, even if you're hard on crime, 40% of those incarcerated have 5 to 10 previous incarcerations. So you're warehousing them, they're getting out, they're hurting somebody again, they're recidivating, they're going back, and they do that 5 to 10 different times. Some of it's technical violations, but I mean, so maybe a pretty generic comment, but the reality is even if you're hard on crime and you believe that these are bad people, how do you change that mentality? Yeah. Because the reality is if you don't help them they're causing more victims. And that's really what they're saying is you hurt people, therefore you should be punished. Well, you're supporting a system that's allowing people to be hurt and hurt and hurt and hurt and hurt because you're not helping them on the front end. Better we educate society that they understand the impact of their belief systems and the impact of the policies. And we get them to understand that this is a society problem. This isn't a prison problem. And we have to help these folks that come in there and give them a fair chance. And so that's why I love engaging in these podcasts. I don't know how many are going to listen. I don't care if it's one or if it's two. That's 2 people now that are more engaged than they were before. I
guarantee a lot of people will listen to this one because, it's a different turn on what we usually talk about, but this also goes into 275 prisons in the United States on the Adovo platform. So these guys and women that are behind there are listening to us talk about that there are ways, and hopefully if it gets to them, they'll be open to it, because these are the things. The other statistic that we didn't bring up, but it's one that always, I look at and I think, gosh, this can't be right, but it is. The U.S. makes up 5% of the world's population and has 20% of the world's prisoners. So if you look at that number, then that means it's wrong. That means that can't be right, but it is. And so that means our system's wrong. So there's no reason why we should have that number be that high unless we have a broken system, and some of the other people have a better system that isn't quite like the bad numbers that we have. So I think, Brian, you've got all the right things and tools that and the people that you've got on your staff are incredible. I wish I could put up your website of all the people that you have on your board and the people who work with you, because it's so impressive of their backgrounds. But those are the type of things that really change things. I mean, you can't change anything unless, perfection's one thing, but taking action's another. And you're taking action, and those actions you're taking, I think there's enough people out there, just like you were talking about the person who was giving donations. They're also looking for ways that things could be better, especially people in business that look at that. And like you said, a business that we're talking about would close down. You couldn't operate a business with those type of numbers. 2/3 and 3/4, those actually are going out of business numbers. I want to ask you though, Brian, because I always ask everybody on the podcast, you've been through a lot of different things in your life. I mean, and now you're getting into a new version of what you've been through in your life to even create more change. What should the listeners think of you as your biggest takeaway through all the things that you've done up to this point and what you want to accomplish?
I'm a Marine. I mean, I'll tell you straight up, and Marines, the worst thing for a Marine is to die of old age and disease. It's about doing good for our world, and it's, the word fight, which might not be the best analogy, especially with us, we're trying to remove military from corrections. But the reality is I found my purpose, and many people can't say that.
I'd say it's a passion.
Why am I working in prisons? Why am I working in corrections? This makes no sense to me. What am I doing? I could do something different. I could do something else. Until it hit me, that's why I've gone through all this, because I'm a Christian, this is a faith thing, but I've been asked to take the lead to change this, through a whole lot of life experiences, good and bad. But I know how to do it. And so it's, I'm going to go to the deathbed with a big smile on my face, that I've impacted millions and millions, within corrections, within underserved communities, through this effort. So this isn't, people say, well, you don't have a prison. You're over 2 years old. You don't have a prison yet. Why you keep doing this? Because it's what I'm supposed to do. And it takes longer than 2 years to challenge a culture and a system that no one's been able to fix in our country. But it's folks like yourself, Brent. It's folks like your listeners. We're the ones that are going to pull together, and we're going to make this work. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
I love it. I love what you're doing. If people want to get a hold of you, is the best way to do that is go to the website, which is, spcor.org. Is that what that is? SPCOR, SPCOR. .org. And it's a great website too. There's a lot of information there. And I think you can make donations there. You can do a lot of different things there. But Brian, man, I hope, and I know because you are a Marine, you will keep up the good work, because man, is it needed? Is it needed? So keep it going. For those out there listening to this, if you got something out of this today, and I know you did, go follow the show on Spotify. Hit the bell. On the Apple, hit the little 3 bars in the corner. It's easy to follow. It's on all platforms, and I know it's a hassle. I know, but I say it every time. If you leave a review, it puts the show on steroids. I don't know what it is with the algorithm, but please do. If you want to know more about what I've got going on, BrentCassidy.com. It's with a TY, not a DY. And as I used to say when I was writing my emails back and forth from prison, stay strong. I'll do the same. Brian Koehn, keep up the good work, man, and thanks for being on today. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me.